People often ask me how I became an astrologer, and I think it's finally time to tell that story for the first time. So in this video, I'm going to give you the whole story, from my childhood fascination with the strange and uncanny, to my years in East Asia and Papua New Guinea, to the moment that the planets aligned in my own life and forced me to reckon with the reality that astrology is very real. I'm hoping it'll give you a sense of who I am, how I came to this work, and why I'm dedicated to it. Hope you enjoy it. Please do give the video a like, subscribe, and all that jazz, because it really does help the channel. And so, without further ado, let's begin. Spiritual awakening is often thought to come in a sudden moment of realization, when the light of truth changes your life in an instant. But it happens just as often in stages, with false starts along the way. The great mythologist Joseph Campbell called these false starts the refusal of the call. The hero receives a call to adventure and is invited into the unknown, but due to fear, doubt, or duty, he turns it down. I turned down the adventure of astrology more than once due to deep-seated fears of the occult. As a young boy, I was obsessed with strange phenomena: ghosts, aliens, monsters, spontaneous human combustion, possession, stigmata. Years of ideological indoctrination and psychological conditioning, commonly known as school, knocked those obsessions out of me, and I ended up with a worldview typical of anyone who grew up in England in the late 20th century. It went something like this: there is no God, spirits and magic don't exist, and the scientific method is the only reliable framework we have for learning new things. It was a worldview that left me fearful of the future, deeply cynical, and haunted by the sense that my life was missing something vital. In 2010, while living and working as a journalist in Thailand, a place where the realm of spirit is still mostly seen as very real, I staged my first major rebellion against rationality. The instigator of this rebellion was the moon. Surprisingly few people are aware of how screamingly weird the moon is. Once you think about it in the right way, you can't avoid that conclusion. The weirdness can be distilled to a single striking fact. The apparent size of the moon is almost precisely the same as that of the sun. At a total solar eclipse, as the sun's corona blazes around a blackened void, the universe spells this out for us. If you don't think this is weird, keep thinking about it until you do. At work is an exquisite cosmic geometry. The moon is 400 times smaller than the sun, but 400 times closer to the Earth. According to NASA, there are at least 214 moons in our solar system. Only ours produces what you could call perfect eclipses. According to the scientific establishment, this is nothing but coincidence. From time to time in my life, I've gone through periods of staying up late, looking for occult information in books or on the internet. These forays stoke in me a kind of delicious terror. One such night in 2010, I was hit with the realization of how miraculous the equality of the sun and moon really is. In our skies, we see perfect balance between the two preeminent celestial bodies, the source of light and the body that reflects it. I knew little of what spiritual traditions had to say about the symbolic meaning of the sun and moon, but I was hit with the sense that this was a message from the cosmos, one that had to have been placed there by design. That led me to a grander conclusion. Everything we're told about the nature of the cosmos must be wrong. Looking back, I can see now that this was my first call to the adventure of astrology. I could feel a pull to dig deeper into this cosmic intuition at the time, to pull on the thread and see what other esoteric truths might be attached to it. But I was resistant. I had the sense that to do this in earnest would change me as a person. And with the possibility of change came fear. And so I left behind my late night forays into the occult. I later began to dabble with the I Ching and was struck by its clarity and pointed accuracy. But at that time, playing with divination felt like a game, a naughty protest against reality, and it didn't take. Soon after my lunar revelation, I found a job with an international humanitarian organization in Bangkok. And then in 2016, that same career took me to the place where my magical awakening really began: Papua New Guinea. Papua is a large island in the Pacific, just north of Australia. The western half is the Indonesian province of West Papua, while the eastern portion is the independent state of Papua New Guinea. It's spectacularly beautiful and spectacularly rich in many of the resources that drive the modern world: gold, copper, oil, gas, timber. For this reason, PNG, as it tends to be called, is the very definition of a country afflicted by the infamous resource curse. For poor, undeveloped countries with great natural wealth like Papua, the story of the past century has often been the same. Corrupt elites do cozy deals with multinational corporations, siphoning off the profits of lucrative resource deals for personal, or perhaps more accurately, clan gain. The result is massive wealth disparity, failure to develop, and endemic violence. It was this violence that brought me to PNG. The humanitarian organization I worked for as a communications specialist was trying, unsuccessfully I must add, to prevent and alleviate the consequences of tribal violence there. I knew nothing about the place when I arrived, but I count my time there as one of the most meaningful periods of my life. Papua is quite literally a magical place. The practice of magic is common to everyday life, and it's part and parcel with the tribal violence that afflicts much of the vast highlands region. Clans accuse each other of conducting magical attacks. Villagers are razed to the ground in response. Women suspected of being witches are put on pyres and burned alive. What struck me was the sense that for the people of PNG, magic was absolutely real. It was real enough to burn a person alive over it. And it was real because everyone believed in it. My move to PNG followed many years living in Southeast Asia, where magic is equally present in everyday life. Over time, my conviction that the West's desiccated version of reality, no spirits, no meaning, just atoms bashing into each other, was right, and the spiritual cosmos of the people around me was mere delusion, had begun to fall away. Indeed, it started to seem like the height of arrogance. The American psychologist Charles Tart, a pioneering scholar of altered states of consciousness, parapsychology, and transpersonal studies, developed the notion of the consensus trance, which holds that our sense of reality is developed through a process of collective indoctrination, akin to hypnosis. As we grow up, each of us is initiated into the version of reality of the society in which we live. The consensus trance we partake in shapes not only what people believe, but what's possible. But years living in parts of the world where spirit was very real had started to snap me out of the Western materialist trance. Other things, miraculous things, were becoming possible, real even. I grew up terrified of ghosts. For years, I wouldn't go upstairs in my childhood home at night without one of my parents, but I never actually saw a spirit in England. By contrast, I've had several such experiences in Asia. I saw a white lady at my door in a Vientiane hotel, a corpse-like man on a sofa in a Bangkok Airbnb, and an inky black spirit man running across a road and disappearing into a rice field in Bali. This is not to say that people don't have such experiences in the West, but it seems to vary with psychic sensitivity. I don't think I'm very psychic, and I think I needed to be shaken out of the consensus trance of my home country to become more open to the spirit world. My life in PNG meant the cosmos was becoming magical, and my induction into that magical worldview was twofold. By day, I was talking to Papuans for whom magic was absolutely real. By night, in the strange way that 21st century allows us to be in two places at once, I'd become addicted to a podcast, the Duncan Trussell Family Hour. Trussell is a stand-up comedian with mystical leanings. He and his guests, people like occult historian Mitch Horowitz, Ram Dass associate Raghu Marcus, and meditation teacher Jack Cornfield, talk magic and weirdness and woo. One of his regular guests was a man named Jason Louv, who ran an online school for magic. Not the David Blaine variety, but the sort of real magic, spelt with a K to distinguish it from stage conjuring, practiced by Aleister Crowley. I was intrigued by Louv and Trussell's long conversations about magic, and by the idea that you could use it to make profound changes to your life and circumstances. I was tempted to sign up to Louv's school, but once again, fear held me back. In Christian countries, programming against the occult runs deep. I liked to think of myself as a rational person, but there was part of me that believed that the practice of magic led to misfortune, madness, and perhaps even damnation. And so once again, I refused the call. In 2018, I was living in Kiev, Ukraine, working for the same organization that had taken me to Papua. In purely material terms, I was doing well. I had a much more senior position, I was being well paid, and I was in charge of a team of 15 communication specialists. But I was also deeply unhappy. I felt out of my depth and I'd become disillusioned with humanitarian work. You can't lead a team if you don't believe in what you're doing. Stressed, miserable, and feeling like a fraud, I was desperate to find some new sense of meaning in my life. Still haunted by experiences in Papua, I became obsessed with answering a simple question: is magic real? And so, one day in early 2018, in a moment of rebellion against the straight world that I was becoming increasingly disillusioned with, I signed up to Louvre's magic school, magic.me. The school had several courses to choose from: ceremonial magic, chaos magic, the I Ching, the tarot, and so forth. Early in one of them, Louvre made a striking demand of his students. First, they should write an entire autobiography explaining the sequence of events that had led them to set off on the magical path. And then this. He said, "You must make a solemn declaration to the universe of your wish to become a magician." He said, adding a little darkly, "and it should not be taken lightly, because once you're on the path, you're on the path." I have to confess, I chickened out of making that declaration. And while I found the course material fascinating, I was resistant to actually doing the actions and rituals prescribed. The part of me that remained fearful of the occult held me back. Listening to lectures was one thing, but actually doing rituals and casting spells and stuff felt like crossing an invisible line. And if I crossed it, who knows where I'd end up. But one part of the course really did grab me. Louvre emphasized that before doing magic, you must understand your true will, by which he meant something like your true spiritual path or innermost purpose. It's this true will that's referred to in Aleister Crowley's infamous maxim, "Do what thou wilt, that shall be the whole of the law." It's an injunction to the magician to uncover and follow his true purpose in life, not to selfishly revel in whatever petty desires might trouble him. Louvre pointed out that there was no use doing magic if you didn't know who or what you wanted to be in the world. And to uncover this true will, the neophyte magician needed to learn the ropes of an ancient science, astrology. Astrology is not scientifically true, but it is poetically true, he said. He advised going to astro.com, looking up your natal chart, and learning to read it. At that point, I had no strong feelings about astrology. My sense was that it was a relic of the ignorant past. It had by fluke managed to abide to the present day, and it was kept alive as a kind of parlor game in the form of the newspaper horoscope. Astrology was harmless enough, I thought, but actually taking it seriously was a little silly. It was the kind of behavior you'd expect from people who talked about vibrations and energies. It wasn't my kind of thing. Still, I was willing to follow the instructions, and I couldn't see any great harm in learning more. And so I began to dip my toes into astrology, much in the same way that most people do. The exact time and location of your birth is needed to calculate an astrological chart. I put my birth details into astro.com. I looked at the planetary placements, the signs and houses that planets were located in, and then I read website descriptions of what they were supposed to mean. While I can't say that everything felt accurate, most of it did, and far more than I'd expected. What I was reading made sense in a way that felt a little too true, a little more accurate than it should have been. In my amateurish way, I understood that the heavy Gemini influences in my chart suggested a life focus on communication, and I was working as a communication specialist. I figured out that I had a lot of influence from Mercury, the messenger of the gods, the cosmic trickster. I'd already published a book, A Guide to Life and Culture in Bangkok, Thailand, and I'd started working on a second one, which was going to be about internet trolling. In other words, on the deeds of the trickster. Perhaps there is something to this stuff, I thought. And then, soon enough, I read a book about astrology, one that changed everything for me. Cosmos and Psyche is a legendary book in astrological circles, and it was written by someone who wasn't primarily known as an astrologer when it was published, a historian, a philosopher, and college professor named Richard Tarnas. According to legend, in publishing Cosmos and Psyche, Tarnas carried out what might be called a bait and switch with the academic establishment In 1991, he'd published a book entitled The Passion of the Western Mind, which was a lauded history of Western philosophy. The book received rave reviews and became a set text in universities across the United States. In 2006, he followed it up with Cosmos and Psyche, the book he'd wanted to bring to the world all along. In almost 600 pages of dense writing, Tarnas set out to show that historical events resonate to archetypes associated with the planets and that there are rhythms to history. In other words, Tarnas sets out to show that astrology is real and it can be used to describe and elucidate history. These were not the kind of ideas one's supposed to promote in serious literary or academic circles. In the mainstream press, the book was widely ignored or even panned. Writing in the Wall Street Journal, the literary critic Thomas Meany described the premise of the book as, quote, sounding like an elaborate joke, and its content as, quote, unadulterated crackpottery. But to those of a more open-minded bent, it was a revelation. Until I read Cosmos and Psyche, I had no inkling that astrology could shed light on history in this way. I'd understood it as a tool for character and psychological analysis. Here was astrology operating at a scale and scope far beyond anything I'd previously encountered, and it was being taken seriously by a highly intelligent and well-read scholar of philosophy. The introduction to the book made a particularly strong impression. Tarnas describes the process of disenchantment that took place in the West over the course of centuries as the new scientific paradigm swept old beliefs away. The banishment of astrology from the academy was a part of this process. Tarnas conveyed something of the tragedy of what was lost in that process, a sense of the cosmos as infinitely meaningful and alive. Quote, for all the exalted numinosity of the Copernican birth, the new universe that eventually emerged into the light of common day was a spiritually empty vastness, impersonal, neutral, indifferent to human concerns, governed by random processes devoid of purpose or meaning. At a deep level, human consciousness was thereby radically estranged and decentered. It no longer experienced itself as an essential expression and focus of an intrinsically meaningful universe. In these words, I found a description of an estrangement that existed in me. But as excited as I was by Tarnas's vision of the cosmos, the book made me afraid. This was a radically different cosmos to the one I thought I lived in. And if history really did unfold according to rhythms and archetypal forces tethered to the planets, what else was true? Taking Tarnas's ideas seriously, I started to feel myself becoming unmoored from reality. Soon enough, if I continued to pursue them, the solid ground I thought I stood on might disappear entirely. That feeling intensified when I started reading blogs written by professional astrologers. What stands out in my memory now is how many of them were talking in prophetic and sometimes doom-laden tones about a year arriving in the not-too-distant future, 2020. 2020 would be of incredible cyclical importance, they said. The events of the year would be traumatic, highly challenging, and would force us to revise all our assumptions about the world. In time, a new world would be born. I remember reading the phrases world crisis, great transformation, and societal reset. I don't recall reading predictions of a pandemic in particular, but some astrologers did actually make that specific prediction, as we'll see later. Reading all this, though, and not in the finest mental fettle, I became overtaken by anxiety. I'd always fretted about the future. I remember shaking in fear when Boris Yeltsin threatened nuclear war in 1999. I had my climate change is going to kill us all phase in the early 2000s. In a similar way, astrology was making me afraid and stirring once again memories of those dark warnings about the occult. And so in early 2019, I resolved to put astrology aside. It was making me anxious. And more than that, I reassured myself it was probably nonsense. A new conviction overtook me, one that I consciously tried to stoke within myself. 2020 would come and go, nothing would happen, and then these cranks would have to eat their words or pretend they'd never predicted anything of the sort in the first place. And then came 2020. In mid-2019, my humanitarian career took me to Jerusalem. In January 2020, news of a mystery virus sickening people in Wuhan, China had started to emerge. By March, I was in lockdown, living alone in a dingy basement apartment in Palestinian East Jerusalem. I'd responded to the pandemic by indulging myself. I was taking part in online drinking parties with friends. I was getting through a tub of Ben and Jerry's every couple of days. I was drinking too much Captain Morgan. I went weeks and weeks without seeing a single soul in the flesh, save the occasional shopkeeper. For the first few weeks, I'd wake up in the morning having forgotten how miserable life had become. Then I'd remember. It was a weird time, as I probably don't need to explain. And then, one day, a thought came to me. Hang on, hadn't the astrologers predicted this? I searched for astrological writing about 2020, published before that year arrived. There were those phrases again: world crisis, societal reset, great transformation. I knew right away that my attempts to stay away from astrology were over. As far as I was concerned, astrology worked, and I'd have to take it 100% seriously. Part of me knew that I'd found what I wanted to do for the rest of my life, and the fear was gone. The world was scary enough as it was. What I needed was understanding. Soon enough, I discovered the Astrology podcast. Its tone was serious. There was none of the new age fluff you often find in the astrology world. We're not fucking around, the host Chris Brennan occasionally observed. I was hypnotized by his monthly forecast with Austin Coppock and Kelly Surtees. They felt like the serious astrology I'd seen in Cosmos and Psyche. I had to learn more. I took Brennan's course in Hellenistic astrology, a style of traditional astrology he described as being more concretely predictive than modern varieties. I was shocked by the eerie predictive power of zodiacal releasing, a timing technique taught by Brennan that had laid dormant in ancient Greek for almost 2,000 years in the textbook of an astrologer named Vettius Valens. Sometimes the technique predicted significant shifts in people's lives to the very day. I took private lessons with one of Brennan's regular guests, the astrologer Patrick Watson. We had long discussions about the practice and philosophical implications of astrology. It felt like we were unlocking the keys to reality. It was exhilarating. Before long, I'd grasped why the astrologers that had spooked me in 2018 had been so sure that 2020 would be a big year. In January, there'd been a pileup of planets, a mega conjunction in the sign of Capricorn, of Saturn, Pluto, Jupiter, Mercury, and the Sun. The slowest moving planets are the heavyweights of mundane astrology, the astrology of the world. They're said to exert a more powerful influence than the flighty, fast-moving planets of the inner solar system. And so, at the core of this complex of planets was a conjunction of Saturn and Pluto, a combination with a fearsome reputation in astrology. I reread what Richard Tarnas said of them in Cosmos and Psyche. Quote, "The Saturn-Pluto cycle coincided with especially challenging historical periods marked by a pervasive quality of intense contraction, eras of international crisis and conflict, empowerment of reactionary forces and totalitarian impulses, organized violence and oppression, all sometimes marked by lasting traumatic effects. An atmosphere of gravity and tension tended to accompany these 3 to 4 year periods, as did a widespread sense of epochal closure, the end of an era, the end of innocence, the destruction of an earlier mode of life that in retrospect may seem to have been marked by widespread indulgence, decadence, naivete, denial, and inflation." Cosmos and Psyche had been published almost 15 years earlier, yet that description rang exquisitely true to the mood and dynamics unleashed by the pandemic. The Saturn-Pluto conjunction had reached exactitude on January the 12th of 2020. As Chris Brennan pointed out on his podcast, one day earlier, on January the 11th of 2020, news stories reported that a 61-year-old man had died of a mystery virus in Wuhan, China. It was astonishing facts of this kind that made me realize that what interested me most about astrology was its ability to make sense of current affairs and history. Gone was the anxiety. I now felt there was something soothing about knowing that world events, even the most traumatic ones, were all part of the cosmic plan. Around the same time, I discovered the work of André Barbault, a French astrologer who had died in October of 2019, just as COVID-19 was beginning to spread in Wuhan. Like Tarnas, Barbault was a specialist in mundane astrology. As the pandemic hit, his name rang around astrological circles because he'd predicted its arrival almost 10 years earlier. In 2011, Barbault had written, quote, "It may well be that we are seriously threatened by a new pandemic in 2020 to 2021. He'd also predicted the 2008 financial crisis in advance and, perhaps most impressively, the collapse of the Soviet Union, which he'd foreseen arriving in 1989, in writings published in 1952. I devoured the English translation of Barbault's book on world astrology, Planetary Cycles, Mundane Astrology, in which he meticulously documents the coincidence of historical events with various cycles of the planets. I was excited by a revelation. This is how history really works. The revelation was accompanied by another thought, which I imagine all astrologers have entertained at one point or another. Why the hell isn't everyone into this stuff? And there was something else that struck me about the conjunction of Saturn and Pluto on January the 12th, 2020. It seemed to signify something of huge importance, not only for the world, but for me personally. Astrologers are concerned with the precise positions of planets on the ecliptic, which is the apparent path of the sun over the course of the year. Since the planets, roughly speaking, orbit the sun on a plane, all of them follow, with minor deviations, this path in the sky. The zodiac is essentially the division of the 360 degrees of the ecliptic into 12 equal sections, each allotted to one of the 12 zodiacal images or signs. Each of the signs represents a 30-degree division of the zodiac. Each of the degrees is divided into 60 arc minutes, and each arc minute can even be divided into 60 arc seconds. Thus, an astrologer can be extremely precise about the position of a planet in the zodiac at any moment in time. Degrees and minutes are generally enough. The Saturn-Pluto conjunction of January 2020 took place at 22 degrees and 46 minutes of Capricorn. Now, to an astrologer, the most powerful points on any birth chart are the 4 angles. The ascendant, which is the point on the horizon at which the stars on the ecliptic are coming into view. The descendant, which is where they're setting. The midheaven, which is the point high in the sky where the local meridian meets the ecliptic. And the imum-culi, which is the point opposing the midheaven. In the chart of an individual, the midheaven is said to speak to that person's public role and career. It answers the question, who are you out there in the world? In my own natal chart, the midheaven is found at 22 degrees and 46 minutes of Capricorn. Not only the degree of the Saturn-Pluto conjunction, but the very minute. The pandemic had convinced me that I would dedicate my life to studying astrology and that I would need to leave my humanitarian career. And the Saturn-Pluto conjunction that had signified the coming of the pandemic happened precisely at the point of the chart that speaks to career matters. What the hell? Astrologers, diviners, and magicians will recognize this kind of synchronicity. This was the first big one for me, but in my own life and those of clients, I've seen hundreds more. They convince us that we exist in conversation with the universe. When you've experienced many of them, you have no doubts at all about the reality of astrology, or that there's deeper structure, purpose, and intention embedded in this magical cosmos. That's it from me this time. I hope you enjoyed my story, and I'd be keen to hear yours, so please do post it in the comments if you're so inclined. Thanks for listening, and see you again on the channel very soon.